Hi, good morning, everybody. I'm Alex Buzansky, President of Impact Justice, and I want to welcome you to our latest virtual conversation, You Can't Socially Distance in Prison, Health, Wellness, and COVID-19, with Sia Henry from Impact Justice and Carrie Blakinger from the Marshall Project. For those of you new to Impact Justice, we are a national innovation and research center based in Oakland, California, and Washington, D.C. We work around the country to create a more restorative and humane system of justice. Impact Justice is hosting these conversations with a wide range of voices on the front lines of justice reform who can help us to address the challenges, ideas, and opportunities emerging in this moment. For today's conversation, we wanted to tackle a critical issue. As many of us watching today know well, people across the country are working hard to secure the release of as many people as possible from prisons and jails to combat the fatal spread of COVID-19 inside facilities. Because in very simple terms, there is no such thing as social distancing in prison. But we must also remember that as many of us protest and march against police violence and racism and the status quo, that not everyone has a voice in this moment. There are over 2 million people in prison today who can't march in a protest. They don't have access to camera phones, Twitter, the internet, news media, meaningful visits with people from the outside, and the right to vote. So what is going inside of our prisons today? What can we learn and what can we do? Today, to help us address these questions, we have two amazing people. But before I turn to introduce them to everyone, I should note that depending on our timing, we hope to get to the audience questions at the end. So during this conversation, please submit them through the Zoom platform, and we'll do our best to get to them all. So first, let me introduce Impact Justice's own Sia Henry. Sia joined Impact Justice in the fall of 2014 with the Restorative Justice Project, collaborating with communities to establish pre-charge restorative justice diversion programs that, without relying on incarceration, center the needs of those affected by crime and support those responsible in taking accountability. She later left for 2 years to work as a legal fellow at the Prison Law Office. There, she engaged in impact litigation and monitored prisons and jails to improve conditions of confinement. Sia rejoined Impact Justice in 2018 with the National Prison Rape Elimination Act, PREA, Resource Center, training PREA auditors and working to improve audit quality around the country to ensure sexual safety in confinement spaces. In 2020, Sia transitioned back to Impact Justice's Restorative Justice Project, while also spending a portion of her time working on Impact Justice's Building Justice initiative. She also serves on the board of directors for the Prison University Project at San Quentin State Prison, which is the country's first tuition-free and independently accredited college situated inside a prison. Sia, it really is a pleasure to have you here today. Now let me tell you about our other guest, Carrie Blakinger from the Marshall Project. For those who don't know, the Marshall Project is a nonpartisan, nonprofit news organization that seeks to create and sustain a sense of national urgency about the U.S. criminal justice system. They achieve this through award-winning journalism, partnerships with other news outlets, and public forums. In all of their work, they strive to educate and enlarge the audience of people who care about the state of criminal justice. For me, I know the Marshall Project as my daily touch point for what is going on across the country with news and information about the justice system. Carrie is a staff writer at the Marshall Project, and her work has focused on prisons and prosecutors. She previously covered criminal justice for the Houston Chronicle, and her work has appeared in a variety of outlets, including the Washington Post magazine, Vice, the New York Daily News, and NBC News. She's the organization's first formerly incarcerated reporter and is currently working on a memoir to be published with St. Martin Press. And I say this because it's in her bio. She hates the cold, and she is based in Houston. I want to thank both of you for being here today. Now, I want to turn this over to Sia to start this conversation. I'll disappear from this for a while, and I will see you all later. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Alex. And thank you, Carrie, so much for taking the time to do this. Also, thank you to everyone out there who's joined us. I feel like a radio host, but really thank you for joining and caring about these issues. So I wanted to start with a quote from Patrisse Cullors, who's one of the co-founders of Black Lives Matter. And she said, we've just gotten to a point where some people think it's a problem Black people are getting killed in the streets. It's going to take a lot to get people to care about people being beaten in prisons. So I thought that that was not only timely given the overwhelming amount of pain the Black community is in right now and has been in as a result of being subjected to centuries of violence and terrorism in this country, but also given the realities incarcerated people, many of whom are people of color, have faced for decades and are struggling with even more now so during this pandemic. Of course, Patrice was referring to the abuse that happens in prisons, but her point can easily be applied to all conditions of confinement. And unfortunately, we don't have the time to discuss every aspect of what it means to be incarcerated in America over the next 50 minutes. That would probably take us days, if not weeks, to cover everything. So we're specifically focusing today on health and wellness. But before we jumped into the specifics about health inside, Carrie, I was hoping you could start by describing what life generally looks like now in prison, given COVID-19 and the protests.
So obviously, prison life in general is not great, and all of the sort of worst conditions about prisons are exacerbated in this scenario. There's a lot of prisons that are on lockdown. About a third, I think, of the Texas prison system was on lockdown, and all of BOP, all of the federal prisons are on lockdown. Many other states are on lockdown, either the entire state system or specific prisons. And what that means can vary. Like what lockdown looks like can vary quite a bit. Sometimes it means that you're basically in a warehouse and you have a little cubicle or you have a bed and you maybe can't leave your cubicle. In some cases, you can't leave like your bed in this sort of immediate area around it. You're often getting served food. So sometimes that means you get, the little styrofoam clamshell that has like some actual food in it. But sometimes it means that you're just getting brown bag lunches of sandwiches for weeks on end. You're not going outside. Some of these people haven't seen sunlight for literally weeks. Sometimes the cells have like a horizontal window, and you often get in trouble if you stand on your bunk to look out that window. But, not everyone really has access to sunlight anyways, even through windows, depending on the state and the exact rules. And then there's all these sort of other problems like showers. A lot of them aren't getting regular showers. I've talked to people that have, had periods of time where they showered like once every 16 days, once every 18 days. Best case scenarios I'm hearing are people that are getting access like every 3 or 4 days. And the sewage situation is not great. Some of these prisons are old. A lot of these prisons are old. And, they'll have water outages. They'll have toilets that are, overflowing, backing up. And this is all sort of worse when you're locked in the cell. It's not like you can go out to the day room when your toilet's overflowing. Like you're locked in that cell. So you sort of have all of these existing problems with conditions of confinement that are now exacerbated because you're just in a cell. And when you sort of step back and think about that and sort of really imagine what that's like to be in a cell, maybe with another person for weeks on end, when you can't call your family, you don't have visits, you don't have any classes, you haven't seen sunlight in probably weeks, and you're living on, Spam sandwiches. I mean, that's really dark. I mean, I cover prisons. I've been in prison. Sometimes even so, when I stand back and think about what's happening, it really shocks me.
Yeah, I think that's a excellent point. As Alex mentioned, I worked for a span of time at the prison law office, which has led efforts to improve conditions of confinement through impact litigation. And I have conducted a number of audits of prisons, both in California and also in Arizona, and in a couple other states. And you're absolutely right. Like each time, you never get used to it, right? So specifically with the prison law office, in 2001, they filed basically the largest ever prison class action lawsuit, which alleged a number of things, but mainly it was against a California prison officials for being deliberately indifferent to incarcerated people's serious medical needs. And the complaint outlined a whole number of super horrific conditions, but one that really stood out to me was basically the fact that one person was dying on a weekly basis due to inadequate medical care. And, so that was, back in 2001. So now, I guess we're 19 years later, and there's still an overwhelming room for improvement in terms of medical care in these spaces. So, for instance, in 2018, right before I left the prison law office, the prisons remain severely incapable of meeting people's, not just both their basic needs, but also their serious medical needs for a number of reasons. And that really started with looking at understaffing, right? So there was one prison where they were at a 50% vacancy rate in medical staff positions. They had a high turnover rate. Some staff would literally start their first day of on the job in the morning and walk off the job hours later. And so all of that resulted in this huge backlog of about 1,000 pending medical appointments, which meant that medical staff are not only seeing people way past that legal deadline where they needed to see people, but some of them even admitted that they didn't even know who at the facility was dying because people with life-threatening conditions were being lost in that sea of backlogged appointments. And again, that was back in 2018, right before I left the prison law office. So Carrie, I was wondering what trends you've seen in terms of medical staffing levels in the prisons that you've been monitoring.
I mean, medical staffing is not great anywhere. In the federal prisons, there was a report, they had an oversight report by their OIG in 2016 that, raised some red flags about some that were at crisis staffing level, even at some of the medical centers, because the federal prison system is big enough that they have like specific prisons that are the medical centers. But even earlier this year, there was a report on hepatitis C treatment, and there were some prisons that said that they weren't able to provide hepatitis C treatment pre-pandemic because they didn't have enough medical staff. So, if you couldn't provide treatment for this this report came out in, I think, like February, before the pandemic, you can only imagine, one of the prisons that we looked at for a story that's coming out later this week, we found that there were, no paramedics on staff at one of the hardest hit prisons where there had been, a few dozen people hospitalized for COVID, so it's clear that there are medical understaffing issues. These keep being raised in different prison systems. The Texas prison system has also, in some of their medical committee meetings, brought up the fact that they've been medically understaffed, but sometimes it's really difficult to get your hands around exactly how medically understaffed they are, because, the sort of same problems that apply in regular staffing is that, your optimal number is kind of made up. So it's really easy to juke the stats on how understaffed you are or are not. But, almost nobody becomes a nurse or a doctor to be like, hey, I want to pick the lowest paying position I can find in this field and work inside a prison. I mean, aside from whether or not you feel safe working inside a prison, like, it's a really inconvenient working environment. Like, you can't have your cell phone with you all day. Like, there's serious disincentives to working in a prison. So it's hard to staff them.
Yeah. And I'm glad you mentioned Hep C. That was something that was like such a contentious issue in both California and in Arizona. I mean, the treatment for it is so expensive. And I believe it was Arizona where what we were hearing was that essentially they would wait for it to get bad enough. And then once it got bad enough, it was essentially kind of like a lottery system. And like, maybe if you're lucky enough, you'll get picked to get this treatment. And even if you had medical insurance on the outside, right? So let's say you're only in for a span of time, or you're married and you're under your spouse's medical insurance, you couldn't access that insurance. So even if you could pay for it, if there was a way to cover it, you still couldn't get access to that. And so I'm wondering, like, what you've seen just in terms of the quality of medical care in facilities.
The quality of medical care is not good, and there's a number of reasons for that. I mean, it's not just simply that, medical staff don't care. I'm sure there's some where that's a part of it. I think there's also a sort of cultural, like in prison medical staff, there tends to be a culture of believing that prisoners are not being honest about their conditions. So I think that's a factor. And then, there's also the issue of, the real budgetary issues and the staffing issues we mentioned. But, those sort of all come together to some medical conditions that can be really appalling. I think a sort of good example is some stuff that I covered in Texas. And it's not the most pressing example, but I think it's just representative. In Texas, for about 15 years, if you didn't have any teeth, they would not give you dentures. They would instead blend your food up, like take your whole mess hall meal, put it in a blender, puree it, and put it in a cup. Sometimes they would separate the different foods. Sometimes they wouldn't. And, the idea that was our solution is, I think, appalling. Obviously there are some people that chose to be like, well, they're prisoners, pay for their teeth, which is, mind blowing. But I think that's just a sort of representative example, because this was their broad policy. This was not a one-off. This is not one person suing. This was their broad policy. I wrote about it. They changed it, and they've begun. Actually, they got 3D printers to start 3D printing dentures on site, which I think is the first prison system to do that. And they've started doing that some, but obviously all of this sort of stuff has gotten sidetracked by COVID. But there's a lot more serious medical conditions that you're not seeing treatment for either. I mean, I hear stories all the time about people performing like minor surgical procedures on themselves. There was one guy who they didn't take him to an outside hospital for a staph infection because they were so understaffed, they didn't have the ability to transport him. And by the time he was released, I mean, his arm, like it didn't even, like the pictures, like basically didn't even look real. Like his whole arm was just, eaten away and infected. And that's obviously a particularly visually appalling scenario, but this sort of neglect is not uncommon. I mean, a couple of weeks ago, I talked to a guy who had untreated cancer for a year. I recently was looking at a death report where a guy died of cancer that he'd never been diagnosed for. Like, they finally took him to the outside hospital and they were like, oh, hey, you have stage 4 cancer. And he died like a few hours later. I mean, not saying that's impossible to happen in the free world, but, I think it is part of a trend or a pattern in prisons. So, there's just a never ending sea of bad medical care examples.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, all of this sounds so familiar to me. I helped audit a prison in Arizona once, a women's prison, where I literally just was so, I was blown away by it. I met person after person who had cancer. Medical staff literally never bothered to tell them. We thankfully had access to everyone's medical records in Arizona, everyone who was incarcerated, as well as in California. And so people would write to us and say, hey, I got a test a month ago or 2 months ago, and I don't know what's happening. And they would have to hear from us via a letter saying, hey, we're so sorry, you have cancer. And that was also something that, as a result of our lawsuit, that the prison systems were technically required to tell people of test results that they were never doing. So, and I've realized in preparing for this conversation, I've realized that a lot of people aren't aware that incarcerated people have to pay a copay in order to access medical care. Thankfully, last year in 2019, California did away with charging incarcerated people copays, but my understanding is that a lot of states are still charging that. So I was hoping you could talk a little bit about what that looks like, how much copays usually are, what they cover, and if they're still being charged during the pandemic.
So the last sort of national survey that I've seen on this was last year. I think before California made that change. I think Illinois made a change last year as well. So I think that means that there would be around 10 states that don't have medical copays now. I mean, there could be other ones I was missing. It was like 8 before Illinois and California, but there could be other ones that changed it as well. Point is, majority are charging copays in general. Many have suspended it due to the pandemic. What exactly those copays look like and how they work varies a lot from, prison to prison, or, sometimes jails charge them as well. Texas had the biggest one. It was $100 a year. So you would pay once, but then you're good for the whole year. And they changed that They changed that last legislative session, and I forget what exactly they changed it to, but it was something that was more like per appointment, I think. You know, and the thing is, somebody did a analysis on this at the time, and I think it might have been on the Grits for Breakfast blog. He's a blogger, criminal justice blogger here in Texas. He's great. But it's a huge expense for incarcerated people because you're getting paid, you know, cents on the hour if you're getting paid at all. In Texas, we don't pay prisoners when they do, you know, prison labor. In some states, they pay them 16 cents or 50 cents. I think the average in New York is around 64. But if you're charging them a copay that's like, you know, $2 a visit, $5 a visit, $10 a visit, $100 a year, you know, this is huge. If you Google Prison Policy Initiative has a very good breakdown of what these costs would translate to in, like, for you, if you as an outside person were getting charged equivalent copays, and it's something like, you know, $500 copay per appointment, you know, which is obviously a huge disincentive to getting medical care. Not to mention, a lot of people don't have any faith in the care that they're getting, and in some cases are reluctant to get any medical treatment because they feel that it's only going to make them worse, which is probably not an unfounded fear in many systems.
Yeah, I think that that's a great point. Like, especially now, so I last week spoke to some former colleagues at the prison law office that said that basically in both Arizona and California, and I'm sure there's other places, if you go off site right now for medical care for any type of like specialty need situation, then when you return to the prison, they're putting you in that 14-day quarantine, and you're essentially being quarantined in solitary confinement. It's really, I mean, which is, you know, again, different conversation, but you know, really not where you want to be. And so a lot of people, and especially in Arizona, right, like it's hot, it's the summer, they don't have air conditioning, and you're basically being put in this box for 14 days because you chose to seek medical attention. And so especially people who, so that's disincentivizing people, in addition to everything you just raised, disincentivizing them from even, you know, admitting or from reporting that they might be experiencing coronavirus symptoms or any other type of serious medical symptom. So I remember once I was at a facility where I was hearing that from the incarcerated people there that the facility didn't use laundry detergent to wash clothes because it was too expensive. So they were just using water. And then the correctional officers were essentially writing people up, so giving them disciplinary tickets or infractions if they attempted to wash their clothes in their cells using their own soap. And that same facility has at times been found to have E. coli contaminated water. So basically the same water that the incarcerated people were using to shower or brush their teeth. So I was wondering what connections, if any, you've seen between like hygiene and lack of cleanliness in these spaces and illness in prisons.
You know, I think it's also worth mentioning that, like, I mean, we're talking about like hygiene, but there's also some, you know, sort of even more basic issues about like the, you know, toxicity of these facilities. You know, some of these people are being in federal prisons. I'm sort of repeatedly hearing their shoddy quarantine practices, but they're moving people to, you know, buildings that have been out of use for 3 years because they had black mold 3 years ago.
Yeah.
You know, at Coleman, which is the largest of the federal correctional complexes, they had a Legionnaires outbreak for months that they never really dealt with before all of this happened. You know, and obviously, like I mentioned before, many prisons are old. They have these plumbing problems. I was writing about a prison in Texas here where they had, and this is actually not uncommon, but we just happened to get good sourcing on this to be able to tell the story in this instance, where the water had gone out because the city turned it off because they needed to do some line repairs. And then everybody had the choice of like, okay, do you shit in your toilet, you know, just pile it on top of each other all day, or, you know, you take a bag of chips and eat, like, bad choices all around. And, you know, they end up filling up their toilets, and then when the water goes back on, everyone flushes at once. Well, the valves have been known to have problems at many of these prisons in Texas. So that ends up bursting a bunch of like water lines, and they end up with like, you know, feces contaminated water all over their cells. So when we're talking about hygiene, you know, the basic conditions of some of these prisons make that really difficult. But yeah, I mean, oh, and also I should say, you layer on top of that, you have some very mentally ill and intellectually disabled people in prison. If you have someone, and these are real examples, if you have someone who is, hallucinating snakes and demons, or who has tried to, eat their own arm, or who, there's one guy in Texas who gouged out both his eyes and ate one of them. Like, if you have people that are at that level of mental health, like, how are you going to teach them good hygiene when it's a life or death situation? Prisons are just ill-equipped to deal with hygiene and mental illness. And when you combine them during a pandemic, even in the best case scenario, if you have a responsive prison system that has people in charge who deeply care about their prisoners, like, I still don't know what the answer would be.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember being at a talk once, and someone said, even if you had a prison that was completely constitutional, met every complete constitutional requirement, it would still be a really awful place, which I think is a really great case for abolition. But again, another conversation. But I'm glad you brought up the mental health issue, because so most facilities have protocols staff are required or supposed to follow when someone reports experiencing a mental health crisis. But I've met so many incarcerated people who said that, for instance, when they tried to tell officers in their housing units that they were feeling suicidal, instead of the officers taking them to medical, which was part of the protocol, the officers would tell them, go ahead and kill yourself. Or they would beat them up because they didn't want to have to fill out the paperwork. Or they would put them in like these little holding cages and throw things like soap at them. And then from the people that I've spoken to who have been able to access mental health services, I've heard of stories of like group therapy, essentially just consisting of a handful of patients, each in their individual little human cage, watching a movie. And others have said that their mental health clinicians have shared confidential information about them with other prison staff that has then been used against them. So I'm curious if you can talk a little bit more about the ability of incarcerated people to access meaningful mental health services, I guess both before the pandemic and especially now.
So before the pandemic, I think obviously nobody's getting great mental health care because, prisons just don't have the capacity or the staffing to be offering like therapy to everyone who needs it. Sort of the best case scenario is that you get adequately medicated. And even that, it's real hit or miss as to whether that happens. And this is not necessarily because people don't care, although in some cases they don't. But even in, like you were saying, even in the sort of best case scenario, like there's just not the staffing, the capacity, the funding to do these things. So there's that. But then if you say that you're suicidal, the response to that, if it's not to just ignore you, can be really, really bad. It's an extreme disincentive to report these things. In Texas, we have specific psychiatric prisons, like 3 prisons that are designated for the people that have like extreme psychiatric issues. And they'll get sent from whatever prison they're at to one of these psych prisons and held there until they're, a little better off. We're not like, this is not the same as like a state mental hospital. This is a state prison that focuses on psychiatric people. And one of the things they do there, if you're feeling suicidal, is they put you in a seclusion cell, which is a barren cell with a hole in the middle. That's it. There's nothing. You get like a blanket. I've talked to a number of men who've been in these conditions, and the thing is, like, I've also talked to some, mental health providers, and some of them have said that in these scenarios, like, if they're extremely self-harming, there really may not be a better alternative, like for a very short period of time. The problem is when you leave them there for like days, months, and obviously it's difficult for them to get anywhere with complaints because these are typically extremely mentally ill people who aren't often viewed as, good witnesses to the conditions, and obviously this is the sort of extreme scenario. In most prisons that are not psychiatric prisons, if you say you're suicidal, you're still getting put in some kind of, solitary 24-hour observation. They're probably going to take your clothes. You're probably going to be freezing. They're going to take all your things, so it's, usually if you're in a place where you want to self-harm, like, you need support, you need to talk to people, and they're going to do the opposite of that. It's just prisons aren't set up to deal with like extreme mental health crises well. So that's, pre-pandemic. But, now that we have a pandemic, people who would be at risk and are probably experiencing much more anxiety and depression because, there's a pandemic and they're basically sitting ducks, are in many cases locked in their cells. There was a situation at Texas prison where one man who had a history of, serious mental health issues, killed his cellmate. And, I mean, I don't know what role, like, I think understaffing played a role in how this happened. I don't know what role his mental health treatment or lack thereof played in this. But I do know that other prisoners had said that, he was known to have mental health issues. And like, it's hard to imagine a worse thing to do for someone who has mental health problems than to lock them in a cell with another person who they don't like for weeks and expect that that's going to end well.
Yeah, everything you just said. But I also, just to explain for people who probably aren't familiar. So the suicide cells that you mentioned, that hole in the floor, y'all, is for people to use the bathroom. So you're not even given a toilet, because if you might flood your cell, or I don't know, use it to kill yourself. And so you have a hole in the floor, and then you might just have like a mattress, right, just on the cold concrete. And that's supposed to be like where you go until you're no longer feeling suicidal, because that's, I guess.
Yeah, no mattress though in Texas.
Oh, even better. Wild. Yeah, and I in talking to people at the prison office last week, they said that what's happening with mental health services now is that, so like all of the programming has been suspended because of the pandemic. So what the most you can get now is in terms of face-to-face counseling, is it's all done self-rent, right? Which means that your counselor comes and they're talking to you through the metal door, right? And you could be in your cell with your cellmate, but even if you're single celled, even if you're the only person in your cell, people can hear through the vents. So nothing you're saying is actually confidential, and you're, again, just talking to someone through a metal door, and you have like a tiny little wall. Another thing that I've come across in doing conditions of confinement work is just the reality that people with mental health issues, developmental disabilities, are likely going to serve longer sentences because, let's say they have a life sentence and they go to a parole board, they're a lot of times not going to be able to show like the level of insight that the parole board is looking for in order for them to demonstrate about their crime, in order for them to have their sentence reduced. And so I was wondering just generally what you've seen about that, if anything has changed in that respect during COVID.
I mean, I don't think anything's changed in any sort of positive way, certainly during COVID. One of the other issues with mentally ill prisoners is that they often end up in situations where they're put in solitary confinement and thus cannot complete the programming that they need to get good time or get time off their sentences. And maybe they're in some sort of solitary because they're in, psychiatric treatment. Like, if you are in a Texas prison and you need to complete a program, but you have some sort of, mental health break where you need to be sent to one of the psychiatric prisons, well, you can't do your program now because you're in a prison where that's not offered, so that's, that's one issue, that like, can you complete programming? But, there's also the issue that people who have mental health issues are in a position where they're more likely to not follow the rules or, get into standoffs with the guards, all the things that, could be sort of symptoms of like of a mental health problem, that could be ways that you experience your mental health problems, are things that can get you into trouble in prison. Even sometimes really innocuous things, not just like sort of mouthing off or whatever. But if you're, for example, like kind of OCD and, like to, have I don't know, 10 towels. Like, you can literally go to solitary for having too many towels. So there's all these things that, are behaviors that can get you in trouble in prison, and maybe things that you do as a result of your mental health condition. But when you get in trouble, every little thing can impact your ability to get out.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I know that we're kind of coming down into like 22 minutes, and so I could talk about these things forever. But I mean, I think that, there are so many things and so many layers to how harmful our penal system is in this country. And I think that one of the problems is that the general public is so unaware of what's happening in these spaces, and that's by design, right? So I led a trip to Norway and Finland last fall for about 22 legislators, reform advocates, formerly incarcerated people, funders, journalists, a couple other people. And we went essentially to learn about those two countries' criminal legal systems. And one of the things that blew me away was the level of access their incarcerated people have to the outside world. So, for instance, the prisons give their incarcerated people cell phones, and there are private visitation rooms for families, and most of the incarcerated people can leave the facilities to spend time out in the community with their loved ones. And in contrast, our prisons in this country are essentially operated as black boxes, and it's scary how little oversight there is of penal institutions and how broken the available self-advocacy processes are. So one of the most egregious examples I've heard of was from a formerly incarcerated person who had spent time in a women's prison, and basically the women in a housing unit had band together to hide a SIM card from a cell phone that they had used to record the officers in that housing unit being verbally abusive. And the officers found out about that SIM card, and then since the women wouldn't tell them where it was, the officers locked the housing unit down, stripped the women naked, and proceeded to torture and starve them for about 11 hours. And one of the people, this is the person who I heard the story from, she eventually managed to get into her cell and hang herself with shoelaces to force the officers to call medical staff in. That essentially stopped the torture. So thankfully she didn't die, but she later, after that incident happened, she later tried to use the grievance process, which is basically like the appeals process where you fill out forms, like get your issue to kind of aggrieve things or to get issues met or needs met. So she tries to use the grievance process to report the experience, but her grievances kept getting rejected because the rules only allowed her to include one issue per grievance. And then on top of that, the officers would throw out her mail. So she would try to write to lawyers, and the officers, instead of sending her mail, even legal mail, would throw out her mail. All of that, there was in her housing unit, there was a list of outside hotline numbers that she could call, for sexual assault or other issues. The numbers that she tried to call that were posted in her housing unit were all disconnected, or they didn't work. So I'll never forget when she said, "Who do you tell when there's no one to tell?" Right? And so I know there's a lot in that, but I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about the lack of oversight in prisons and jails, and the kind of, I guess, the common obstacles that incarcerated people run into when seeking help.
Yeah, I mean, I think that sort of encapsulates a lot of the problems that you see. One thing I think is worth sort of thinking about or talking about in this moment is the role of cell phones, because I feel like we're seeing the value of cell phones in the free world with all these police interactions. I think for decades people tended to not believe Black and brown people when they had these stories about the horrible things that police were doing to them. And those are Black and brown people on the outside who don't have a felony conviction, or it's not the basis for the interaction anyways. Whereas, in prisons, it is, again, primarily Black and brown people, primarily poor people, and they are convicted of felonies. So people are very quick to be like, these are not reliable people. Now we're starting to see more cell phones in prisons. And obviously, as you've highlighted, that's a huge risk. And, that's actually, probably not the worst case scenario of what can happen to you when you have a cell phone in prison, because to me the worst thing in that is that, you know, it's a felony, so you can catch another charge and you can end up, you know, spending 5 to 10 more years in prison because of this cell phone. You know, commonly that's not what happens. Commonly, if you get caught with a cell phone, a lot of prisons don't want to deal with all the, you know, prosecuting you and stuff. They'll put you in solitary confinement. They'll put you in SHU for, you know, in federal prisons, it's a lot of guys tell me it's like 2 weeks, you know, but some places it's like a year or 2 years, you know. So, I mean, there's huge risks to having a cell phone, but it's been, as we're starting to see this happen more, it's been such a game changer. And here's an example. In Texas, I was talking about the bad food that you get when you're on lockdown. They give you these brown bag lunches that have, I mean, they're so pitiful. I've been hearing for years about how bad they were. And there was, you know, some guy wrote down what he got every day. He sent me pictures, or he sent someone pictures. And so they, you know, there's no vegetables, there's no fruit. It's literally sandwiches and like, oh, sorry, there's raisins. Sometimes a handful of raisins, but like the sandwiches would be like a green hot dog with like a piece of white bread wrapped around it. Or like there's one that was a sandwich that was their sloppy Joe. It looked like, you know, a little thing of diarrhea in the middle of 2 pieces of bread. You know, and this is what they've been getting served. It's insufficient in quantity and in quality, and clearly doesn't offer, you know, the nutrition a grown person needs. It doesn't, I mean, they're going to get scurvy with that diet, you would think. Yeah. And I've been hearing about these for years, and then finally got my hands on some pictures of them and published those pictures. And this was a week after prison officials have been telling families, no, we're giving them adequate food. That's simply not true. We're giving them adequate food. And then I published this story, and, you know, they have begun to make some changes since then. You know, I've been hearing from guys who said, hey, I got vegetable for the first time in years. And these are like getting those images, like people have to take a personal risk to get a cell phone, to keep a cell phone, you know, to decide who they feel safe they can send it to on the outside. And, you know, it's just, that's something that like, there's so many things you can't document that way. Like, that was great in that it enabled me to shed light on allegations I've been hearing for a long time. And I think it also sort of highlights the press's role as an oversight entity, especially in states that don't really have meaningful oversight in other capacities. But there's limits to that because it's not legal. You know, if there's if an officer beats a dude to death, like, I'm never going to get cell phone footage of that because you have to be out of your cell with a cell phone where someone can see you. Whereas at least with the police, like, they might take your cell phone, they might, you know, threaten to arrest you, but it is not illegal to possess the cell phone. Like, you don't have to hide the cell phone, the fact that you even have one in the free world. There's an assumption that you have one, you know. In prisons, like, it's actually a felony to simply have it. So it makes recording some of the most egregious violations even more difficult. But I do think that just the fact that there are cell phones in prison is becoming a game changer and will continue to be, because, you know, I think no matter what they do, there's not, you know, in the long run going to be fewer cell phones in prison at, you know, at any point really. As long as you underpay staff and give them an incentive to accept money in exchange for, you know, bringing in cell phones, drugs, whatever, you know, there's going to be cell phones in prison.
Exactly. Yeah. So I'm curious what you think, and it's okay if you don't have an answer, but like what can be done to make penal institutions more transparent places, and so that there's more of a, I guess, like a window for the public, or more of that eye, so that there is more like just accountability, transparency, all those things.
I think that would require a serious cultural shift in these penal institutions, which I think fundamentally just don't believe they should be subjected to oversight in many cases. Mm-hmm. So I don't think that's a change we're going to generally see coming from the agencies themselves, with some exceptions. I mean, if you're talking about jails, you can see a huge difference when a new sheriff gets elected. You know, the current sheriff we have here in Harris County is really great. Like, he is a very transparent elected official. And, I appreciate that as a reporter. But, in a lot of other systems, like this is a longstanding cultural issue that I don't really see the agencies themselves changing. However, I do think that, reporters have a huge role here. And I think that, providing oversight is something that, is something that reporters do when they get whatever, when they write about dentures, when they write about food, when they write about, all the details that come out in litigation. I mean, obviously lawyers have a huge oversight role as well, but lawyers are constrained by, what you can litigate, obviously, so, I mean, I think if there's going to be more transparency and accountability, it's going to be from, from outside these systems. It's going to be from reporters, it's going to be from prisoners, having cell phones, it's going to be from lawyers. And, I think that speaks to why, even as newsrooms are really struggling in this economic climate and, struggling with all these sort of allegations of fake news, I think this speaks to why it's really important to support good journalism in areas that are covering this arena. It's important to support criminal justice journalism that is done well and thoughtfully. If you want there to be oversight and you want to be aware of what the problems are in the system, that is currently, it seems like, one of the few venues for it.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And I've been wondering, like, what is it that people can do, people who aren't attorneys or who aren't, journalists or whatever, like, if, people hear these things and what can people do? And I think that's a great point about, supporting, news outlets like the Marshall Project, just as an example. So I guess, like, taking a further step back, and before we open things up to questions for the last couple of minutes, I'm curious, so, like, until we are no longer putting people in cages and relying on an objectively racist system of incarceration that was, born out of slavery, still relies on slavery, and is at its core, as Fania Davis once said, a system that hurts people who we think have hurt people to show them that hurting people is wrong, and until we've adopted on a national level evidence-based approaches to addressing harm, like restorative justice, that allow for people to take responsibility for harm that they've caused while staying in their communities, but also hold society accountable for the direct and intergenerational trauma so many of our communities, especially communities of color, have been subjected to. And I know that was a really long list, but until we've done all of those things, like, what, other than supporting news outlets, are there other things you can think of that people could do, or just, like, other bright spots that you're seeing, maybe that are even, like, coming out of this pandemic?
So, I'm always sort of at a loss in terms of, like, what to tell people to do. I mean, I guess to some extent this is about policy changes, but some of this is like cultural changes and what we fund and how we as a society view prisoners and their value. Because I think one of the roadblocks here is also that, a lot of people are very willing to determine that prisoners just don't matter, that, these people did something wrong, so they deserve all of this bad treatment. Which I is just, if another country were doing some of the things we do in our prisons, we would condemn them and be appalled. So I mean, so there's that. And shit, I forgot. What was the second part of your question?
What can you do, and or, like, just, are you seeing any?
Oh, bright spots. Yes. Okay, bright spots. So the only thing that I feel like out of this pandemic, because everyone became so acutely aware that prisons could be hotspots and that they could be vectors for bringing the disease back into the community. And I think we're going to continue to see more of this as this pandemic progresses, as it sort of, festers in prisons and keeps coming back out to the community. Like, I think that this has made many people realize that prison health is public health, and that what happens in prisons can affect what happens in the free world. So, I think that maybe one thing this pandemic has done is get people to pay attention to criminal justice. I've had a lot more people wanting to, interview me about my reporting and stuff than I used to. And I think that's a good sign. I mean, it could be just, sort of an indication that I don't know, I've happened to do stories that were of more interest, but I think it's an indication that more people are willing to pay attention to criminal justice and specifically to prisons, because a lot of times when people will write about criminal justice or they'll pay attention to criminal justice, their interest stops at the prison gate. And I think that this has been a moment that has caused people to have broader conversations about that. So I guess that's kind of optimistic within a pandemic.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point, in that what's happening in our criminal legal system has kind of been like thrusted to the forefront, maybe not the forefront, but maybe like a little to the left of the forefront of everything that's happening. And it's no longer this siloed, like, oh, like that's something that's over here that we're going to talk about sometimes, but then everything else is separate, because it's not, it all runs together. And I think for me, at least just from this weekend, hearing that the Minneapolis City Council just announced that they are planning on disbanding their police department. Not really sure what that'll look like, but is something that's really exciting about this idea of de-investing from kind of our traditional forms of quote unquote public safety, so police and jails and prison things and things like that, and actually investing that money in communities. So Alex, I hope you're still there. We have 6 minutes left, and I don't know if people have submitted questions. But
it looks like I see some questions here.
Yeah, there's a bunch of questions. I've had some texted to me. We have in the Q&A and the chat. I guess there's a sort of glass half full, glass half empty set of questions, right? In this pandemic moment, right? It is, as you say, Carrie, bringing more attention to people talking and thinking about prisons, which are frequently left out of the conversation, and certainly prison conditions. How do we get more people to care, and how do we get more people out of prison in this moment, right? As the public's eye is already moving to other issues, important issues, right? What can we do? And see, I pose that to you too. It's really sort of throughout the questions. And then I have a sort of half glass, I'm not sure the glass is half full or half empty, but could it be, as we move through this pandemic moment, that the things that we're seeing prisons do with their limited budgets, right? Solitary, no visits, the already poor food getting even worse, et cetera, could that become the new normal? Could the bar even be set lower for what prison is, rather than, seeing this as a moment to understand the public health consequences? So those two pieces.
Well, regarding that last question, it's funny. I see Michelle Deitch here in the chat asking questions. Hi, Michelle. She and I have had this discussion about will this make solitary like more acceptable? Will it, on the one hand, will it be that everyone in the free world is like, oh, sheltering in place is terrible, I don't want to do that, like why solitary is terrible, and realize that it's a bad thing? Or will prisons be like, hey, we got away with this for like months and it was cool, and sort of more broadly put people in solitary, or just be really slow to take to roll back these lockdowns? And I think that's a very real concern. I mean, I do think that many prisons realize that leaving people in lockdown for prolonged periods of time does increase the risk of violence, or riots, or whatever kind of unrest. So I mean, that'll be, I don't know how that'll play out, but I also think that in terms of, I mean, I've been thinking a lot about this in terms of like the conditions, medical spending. Texas has been asked to cut budgets 5% for all state agencies. There's some exceptions within prisons, but one of the presidents of one of the prison guard unions said to me that these facilities are old, they need a lot of work, they need to be replaced, we're understaffed, we actually need a lot more officers than we have. Like, the only way that we are going to manage with a 5% budget cut is if we start talking about decarceration and closing prisons. And this is coming from a prison union official. I mean, he's been advocating for this for a while. His name's Lance Lowry. He's great. But, I think that the only way that we can afford to have conditions not get worse will be if we incarcerate fewer people. And, you know, I don't know which states will have the appetite for that and which states won't. I think that there's a lot of states that are on the verge of being, you know, of having unconstitutional conditions broadly. Like they're already being sued repeatedly for, having unconstitutional conditions. And I think if they get 5% worse, you know, everyone's going to need some sort of federal oversight. You know, there's just not a lot of room for it to get worse and still be within what the Constitution allows.
Great. Thank you. I know we're sort of at time, and there's a lot more to talk about, and there's a lot of questions. And I thank everybody for listening, for submitting questions. I apologize that we don't have more time for it. Sia, Carrie, really, I appreciate both of you taking the time here today and also in sort of talking and putting this together and thinking this through. I want to say the Marshall Project, marshallproject.org, right? Go check it out. Their stuff is incredible. Carrie's stuff writing is amazing. But she talked about cell phones and the food story she did. She has actual photos of what people are being served. It's kind of extraordinary. It's an insight into a world that we really never get to see, vast majority of people. Sia talked about restorative justice diversion and her trip to Norway and Finland. If you go to the impactjustice.org website, you can read about that work, you know, what that offers and the tools and resources there. And again, really thank you all for participating in this. You know, look, we hope that this has been helpful to people. We hope that it's been informative, and we hope that it encourages people to go out and do something, right? That's what this moment calls for. It's all about doing something. We recorded this conversation. We'll email it all to you. We'll post it. Please share with other people if you find that to be helpful. And also, I just want to thank the other people at Impact Justice who have helped make today possible, particularly Hannah Miller, who is really sort of the whiz behind this all. You haven't seen her here today, but she is in every moment that is happening right now, helping us all make this be a success. Thank you, Hannah. We're going to be doing this again in a few weeks. We have a couple of different people and topics we're trying to figure out, but we think this is an important moment to be able to leverage technology to help bring people to a wide audience, to tell stories that other people aren't hearing, and to think about what can be done. Because it is, the glass may be half full, the glass may be half empty, but there is a glass, and we got to fill it the best we can. It's a bad metaphor, but it's what I'm working with here. So please, everybody, take care of yourselves, right? Take precautions if you're out there protesting, but stay safe, speak out, and thank you for being part of today. We really appreciate it. Bye.
Thanks, Carrie.
Thanks, Carrie. Thank you, Sia.